Hi, what is a design system and how to model it using little code are two questions that will be guiding this presentation and that you can find more information about in the two talks that you can see over here. What we are going to do now is explain these concepts in simple ways with a specific example. We will try to model our own design in an application that we will develop from scratch. We intend to give an account of the new step that GeneXus has taken with the design system object and evolution of the theme object in pursuit of the same old objective, achieving maximum expressiveness, saying the minimum. So let's start with the what and then get to the how. We will develop an app for a travel agency that in its web mode will have a home screen like this one, from which you will be able to navigate the page of tourist attractions. And by choosing an attraction, for example, the Louvre, we will see a page with information. But we also want the app to be a multi-experience app. Therefore, we are also going to develop the native app. We will focus first on the web app because what we will realize is that the native app will be fully analogous to everything we'll see. So, if we remember the screens that we just saw for the web app, we will perceive by putting one screen next to the other is that we can already see a design system in action. There are many regularities that catch our eye. We can see that we have a common header for each page, and this common header will surely be implemented in a master page. In the same way, we can see that we have a common footer that will also go to the master page. And if we look at the central area of the pages, obviously we're going to develop them as web panel objects, independent from each other, but also by observing the pages, we can find regularities at a glance. For example, let's focus on the first two screens. If we look at the textual area, they're not only similar, but they're identical in structure. So we can think of using a stencil object to design the controls of that common area. And then we can reuse that stencil on the two screens in the two web panels, that is. So the issue is basically always the same. It's about how to abstract repeated elements to express in the most economical way possible the regularities that operate behind. Now, one first aspect is what we already know, and it's what we've just done, which is to identify the objects we will use for the reuse, such as the master panel, the components, stencils, and more. But the other part, which is where we're going to pause in this presentation, has to do with the controls, regardless of the screens they are on. So it's about how to design the controls by abstracting as much as possible. Now again, if we look at the screens we have and we observe, for example, that text that is repeated in the design of each of the pages, we can already identify that this text is going to fulfill a function in the design, which is the function of being the main title. So why not abstract that style, which is a common style, give it a name? For example, in this case, it occurred to me to give this name, which is semantically relevant because I say that this is a title, and I say that it is negative because it's going to be on a dark surface. And then to this, that I'm going to call a class, I give the specific design characteristics I want. So for example, I establish the color to be white, and then I can have a class, such as an H1 class, with a color black. So just as we identify the regularity in those texts, we can also identify that, for example, we are going to have a secondary title. We can see it clearly on the three screens that I'm going to call H2. I will also be able to have a class to define highlighted texts, and another one, for example, for normal texts. Now, identifying these classes or styles is already modeling the design system. So what is the next step? So for each control of the screens, we have to define their associated style class, and then in a centralized place, we need to define the properties for each of the classes. Now, this centralized place is the design system object. And then it will just be enough to tell the panel what is the design system that will have the properties defined that it will have to use to render those controls. Now, before we used this with the theme object, and now we're doing it with the design system object, which has numerous advantages over the theme. In this link, you can see here, you will find our wiki that compares both objects. So now we will watch a demo to see this in action. Here, I have already implemented the main objects of the application. Here we are looking at the home page that has implemented on it the texts that we see down here, those three texts there. Then, if we go to the events, we can see that in the start event, we have where we loaded the information, what we can see in the text blocks, and we also have a link. On the other hand, this page or web panel will be loaded within this master page that we have here in the content placeholder. So, how does it know which image and what text should be displayed on the screen? Well, in the start event, we will also indicate that depending on the program that is being located in the content placeholder, what should be loaded is this image and this text. So here we see that I already started to design the master page. I have already placed the canvas to include the controls that will be superimposed. For example, here I defined this chatbot image. I have already defined the absolute position that it will occupy in relation to the canvas. And for example, for this text block, this one of the main title, I have already associated to it the H1 negative class that I had already identified. So now the question is, here we see the texts, and here we have the stencil actually inserted. Here we see the stencil, and also for the controls, the text blocks of the stencil, I have defined classes. The classes that we had identified before, that is. So now the question is, where does the style take those classes from? So, if we edit the properties of the home web panel, we see that we have this style property, which is where we indicate which the design system object is that shall implement all of these specificities. And if we go to the version properties, we see that I have already defined the default system to be this travel agency, which is a design system object that I created beforehand. We see it here, but I created it empty. We see that in this tab of tokens, there is nothing, and in this other tab of styles, there is nothing either. That is, we haven't defined the classes yet. We haven't given them style. So let's see what happens when I run the home web panel with this empty design system object. Let's see what we see running. Well, we can see the web panel without any design practically. We can only see the one that pertains to the size of the canvas and the absolute positions, for example, of the chatbot image. So let's look at, for example, to the first text block, that is the main title. We want to design it through its class, a class that we had identified already. So here we put a point and selected, and the class is H1 negative. And now what we have to do is start giving the style characteristics for that class. What we want to get to is this text that we see over here, which we see as white. So the first thing we are going to do is define the color. The color we are going to say in this case is a type of white, and we're going to write it as an hexadecimal. Now another thing that we may want to define now is the font size. So let's say, for example, that we want the font size to be 95 pixels. Now, if we take a good look at these properties, which are the ones that allow us to give the text a style, they are identical to those of CSS, but they are not those of CSS. They're identical to them. Later on, we will see that there are more properties that are not those of CSS, which are typical of GeneXus. And you might ask, well, if I'm using pixels here, then this class will only work for a web app. And the answer actually is no. This will also work when the app is native because there will be a conversion from pixels to dips. Well, I could continue here specifying properties, or what I can also do is find the file that the graphic designers already put together in the program they use. In this case, it was Sketch. And I can inspect the file and find the properties that I am going to use in my design system object. So I can copy them directly, and I want to see now what happens when we hit save. And I refresh the page. And now we see that it's already applying the style. And this is so because I am prototyping locally. Now what we can see is that the text is not taking the font that I defined for the class. And that is because the font is not one of the browser's default font. So what we're going to do is to add the font that I am interested in seeing. I have to have it, and now we're going to see it. It should be a file in the KB. So here what I do is I write the name of the font and I define which of the files that I have in the KB is the one that corresponds to the font. And now I refresh the screen, and yes, we see that the font that we defined is being applied. So perfect! So in the same way, I could define the classes of the other text blocks that I have here. So for example, I select the H2 class, I go to inspect the file that the graphic designers put together for me, I copy the style properties, and afterwards we do the same for the other two classes of texts that we have defined. So perfect, here we also have font families that are not the default fonts, so again we have to incorporate them into the design system. Afterwards, we hit save, we refresh the screen, and we see how the system applies all the styles that we defined. Now, something that may catch our attention is that this text is not actually coming out with the color that we had defined for its class, which was red. And why is that? The point is that this text block was actually associated to a link, and by default, browsers will show it with that color, which is the standard color. So what we have to do is add a property that is going to be called, just as we are seeing over here, which allows us to indicate the class the control is going to use to render itself when it is a link. And here what we're going to define is that we want it to take the properties of this same class. And this is where we see that we don't have a one-to-one analogy between CSS properties and design system object properties. So now we save again and we refresh, and we see now how it uses the color that we wanted. So this is how we would define classes. Now let's look at another topic. These two texts that correspond to two different classes have the same color. And this repeated color is no coincidence because it is part of the abstraction of the design. In the design, we are indicated that both texts have to have the same color. They can have another color, but they have to be the same. And in fact, here it is black because one has to stand out against a background which is white. And we did not specify the white background because it was a default style. But if we go to the home page, for example, and we look at the properties of the main table, we see that the form class that applies to all objects by default can be changed in its background color. So when we select the class form and we specify its background color, we can choose a type of white. So far so good, because here we have white. But the designers put together two screens for this panel for us. One that is in light mode and another that is in dark mode. And here we see that the background color is going to be black, and the text that we have just seen are going to be white. And even the highlighted link, rather than being red, is going to be yellow. So we can already realize that what is convenient for us is to also define those design abstractions within the design system object itself. This takes us one step further in the level of abstraction, and we're going to call them tokens. So for example, we're going to define a token, a color constant, which we're going to call onSurface to refer to the color of the texts that are positioned on the background surface. See that the name of the token already has a semantic content. And here, what we will do is give it the value that that token is going to have for us. I will copy this value that I have here, which was a kind of black, and we see it over there in the right in the other editor. And in the same way, we're going to define a token for the background color, which is initially white. And we're also going to define a token for the application's highlighted color, which, of course, we are going to copy from here. And it's going to be this type of red. So here the only thing we did was define tokens. But now what we want is to go to the styles and modify, in the applicable cases, the values for the corresponding tokens. So here, using the $sign, you can see that we have an IntelliSense that opens up for me, and it will allow us to choose which token category I want to include. And here, the list offers to me the 3 tokens that I have defined so far. Now, in this case, I will define surface, which represents the background color. And I am going to do the same for the color of the main action. I am going to modify it by the highlight token. And for the texts, for the normal text, and for the secondary text, I am going to place the same token. That is, I changed the value for a token. I save this afterwards, and I will clearly appreciate the change when I modify the color, the value of the token on surface. For example, we're going to change the color here for this other one. I'm going to save this. And if I go back to the screen and refresh, I see how this changed. The toText changed simply by changing the value in the token. I didn't have to go looking for the classes to see which ones I had to change a value in. So let's leave the one that we had. So now we want to implement the light and dark modes. This is a light mode. And before that, I'm going to show you something else. Not only can we define color tokens, but we can also define tokens for other categories. Here, we see various examples of the font. I could define, in this case, a token for the main font size and say that, for example, it should be 95 pixels. I can choose another one for the secondary text, and so on. And in that same way that we saw with the colors, I can go to the classes and I can use the tokens instead of the values where appropriate. And we can do this, and the process is analogous. So now we're going to see how to implement the dark mode of the application. And we see that it has these other colors here. So how do I go about reflecting those other colors that are from the same tokens? What we are going to do is define what are known as options. I'm going to define an option that I am going to call color scheme, which will assume one of 2 values, either light or dark. I am defining an option that interests me to vary my design system object, that is my tokens. And here, what will be enough is for me to establish that when the color scheme is light, then the tokens have to have these values here, the ones that we had already defined. And instead, when the color scheme is dark, then the tokens must assume these other values. Now, if I go here, for example, on the on surface in dark mode, I can see that in the editor to the right, I visualize the colors for the colors in the dark mode. And in particular, I can see this highlight that appears as yellow. And yet, if I go to the light mode, I can see that this appears in red. Now, the next question is, why was it all in light mode when we ran the app? And how do I change it to a dark mode? Well, for example, let's go to the master page and let's go to the events. We are going to see in the events what we have defined down here. We assign to the light option to a variable, and then what we're doing is we're using an object to set that option for the color scheme. Now, what is that object? It is a predefined object that is part of the GeneXus module, and we can find it over here. And we can clearly see the set option method that allows me to define a name for the option In this case, it is only one, its color scheme, and give it the value we want it to have. We want to set that value for that option in execution time. So that's why when we open the app, the light mode will show. Afterwards, we have to see where we can change the mode, and we're going to do this in this component that I defined to implement the menu and the image, that is the logo. And the idea will be that by clicking on that logo, I can change the mode. So if the mode was light, I change it to dark, and if it was dark, I change it to light. So let's run the app to see this action. Here we see that it was initialized in light mode because we had put that on the master page in the start event. We can clearly see that those tokens are in operation, but when I click on the button instead, it changed to the dark mode, and we see that simply by taking the new values of the tokens, I can already see the app in this other mode. Here we can also see the chatbot image that also varies by mode. And how do we implement this image variation, you may wonder? Well, if we go to the master page where the image is, we see that the image is called chatbot and is an image that I have already inserted in the KB, and we can see it here. And that image has these variations. So for example, it will be loaded with this file, with this image specifically, when the design system object that applies to the screen that is using this image is travel agency, when the density is 100%, and when the color scheme is light. Because when it is dark, it is going to upload with this other one. So that's where we are implementing the variation by option. So with this, basically, we have covered how the work with the design system object is, what its language is. So we would continue specifying the other classes then to get the application that we want. What I did here was create another design system object that I called in the same way as the previous one, but extended. And why? Because I could have continued specifying the other classes in the object I already had, or I can also import the previous one in this design system object. By using this import rule, I can choose to import into this design system object the previous one, so as not to rewrite everything and reuse it, and to be able to modify it and extend it. So here, for example, I have an H1 class that is the opposite of H1 negative. I commented on the H1 negative because it will come from the other design system object, so I don't need it here. Here we see that in H1, for example, I am making an include because I am including all the properties of the H1 negative class, and I am simply changing the color property in it. So on this design system object, I have completed the work. So now we are going to see what to do so that this now becomes the design system object for the application. And there is no mystery to this. We just come here and change the default style for the extended one. We do a rebuild all. We run the panel. And here we see how our application is taking shape. This is what we had specified so far, and this is what it looks like with the new extended design system object. And we can see a lot of things, like we specified the hover option on the links. Here we can see the attractions page. But not only that, because we can also see that within the design system object, we also achieve responsiveness. I will be sharing with you this KB so that you can investigate this and see how it was done. So at the beginning, we said that what we're interested in is developing a multi-experience app. So I asked a colleague to implement it to show you a panel, the home panel, but natively for devices, for an Android phone specifically. So once again, he implemented the controls on the screen, and he had two ways of doing this. Either he had to design the design system object from scratch and do the same work that I already did by identifying classes and giving them styles and so on, or he could use what I had already done and simply modify what he needed to meet the specific needs of this platform. So here, he imported my design system object, the last one I showed you, and he modified what was needed, and he reused all the rest. So now what we do is we tell the Android phone platform that it has this style as its style, the one that he created by extending mine. So now what I'm going to do is just run the Android platform. I go to the panel, I hit run, and we are going to see that the emulator opens. Over there, we can see the home page and how it started to become implemented. And that is basically the same or very similar to what we had already. So here on this GeneXus server, you can find the KB to download and test everything we already mentioned. So here what we did was model a design system object from scratch. We did it ourselves. The other option is to import the design that the designers put together in their design tool. And that is a GeneXus feature, which is the import from Sketch feature. For now, we can only use Sketch, but this is going to be expanded to include other design tools. And also, of course, we can extend or modify a design system object as we already saw. So what we did in this presentation was study the language of this object to allow us to work with the strategies that GeneXus offers to obtain a good software design. This is done either by using the design system objects that GeneXus provides, such as Unanimo or Carmine, or use the design systems provided by our partners, or perhaps customize them, extend them, or make them our own. And last, I leave you with some talks that you might be interested in. Thank you.